In the quiet suburb of Brookstone Ridge, every lawn was manicured to perfection. Every fence was regulation height, every mailbox identical in color and size. The neighborhood wasn't just peaceful, it was controlled. And the Homeowners Association made sure it stayed that way. For years, Mark Benson had lived quietly at the end of Sycamore Court. He paid his dues, followed the rules, and kept to himself. His home wasn't the biggest or the fanciest, but it was his sanctuary. Behind it stretched a modest backyard, flat, sunny, and wide enough to fit a dream he'd had for years. That dream was a swimming pool. For Mark, the idea wasn't about luxury. It was about freedom, the chance to relax in his own space after long workdays and to spend summer evenings floating under the stars. His family supported it, and after months of saving and planning, he was finally ready. He submitted his pool design to the HOA as required, a modest 20 by 30-foot in-ground pool with a simple deck and a small seating area. Nothing flashy, nothing out of character for the neighborhood. But the HOA, led by its newly elected president, Margaret Sloan, had other plans. Margaret was the kind of person who treated HOA rules as sacred scripture. A perfectionist with an iron smile. She believed her duty was to preserve the visual harmony of the community. Her first term as president had been quiet, but when she saw Mark's pool request, she saw something else, a test of authority. A few weeks after submission, Mark received the letter. Your application has been denied. The proposed structure does not comply with HOA aesthetic standards and may affect neighborhood consistency. There was no detailed explanation, no alternative proposal, just a flat rejection. At first, Mark thought it was a mistake. He reached out for clarification, but his emails went unanswered. When he finally attended the next HOA meeting, Margaret simply brushed off his questions with phrases like community integrity and guideline interpretation. The truth was simple. Margaret didn't want a pool in her neighborhood. Still, Mark wasn't the type to back down easily. He reviewed the bylaws carefully and discovered something interesting. The HOA rules didn't actually ban pools. They only restricted above-ground models and structures that disrupted neighborhood uniformity. His design fit neither description. So he resubmitted the proposal, this time including references to the relevant sections of the bylaws. Weeks passed, silence. Then, another letter. Your revised application has been reviewed and remains denied. Please refrain from further submissions on this matter. It wasn't just unfair. It was personal. From that point on, Margaret seemed to have her eye on Mark's property. He began receiving random citations, his trash cans, visible from the road, his grass, half an inch above regulation length, his fence, need of repainting. None of it had been an issue before, but now every tiny imperfection became ammunition. It was clear the HOA was sending a message. Still, Mark refused to yield. He attended meetings, gathered signatures from supportive neighbors, and documented every correspondence. But the HOA board, made up mostly of Margaret's loyal friends, voted with her every time. Then, one day, something inside him shifted. After yet another rejection letter arrived, this one threatening fines for continued noncompliance, Mark walked into his backyard, looked at the empty patch of grass, and made a decision that would change everything. If they didn't want a pool, he'd give them a pool they'd never forget. He hired contractors, pulled permits directly from the county, legally bypassing the HOA's internal approval, and began excavation. Trucks rolled into the quiet cull, D-sack, digging deep into the earth. The noise echoed across Brookstone Ridge, and by the second day, neighbors were already talking. Margaret was furious. She stormed through the neighborhood with her clipboard, snapping photos and sending complaints to the board. She called the county inspector, trying to halt construction. But when the inspector arrived, he confirmed what she feared most. Everything was perfectly legal. The HOA could regulate appearances, but they couldn't overrule the county. Mark's backyard became a construction zone. The once modest pool design expanded, not intentionally at first, but as an act of defiance. He added a stone deck, underwater lighting, and a cascading waterfall. Every new feature seemed to push Margaret further toward the edge. By the time the project finished, the backyard was transformed into something spectacular. A shimmering blue oasis surrounded by sleek stone and palm trees. It wasn't just a pool anymore, it was a statement. Neighbors began stopping by, complimenting the work. Some quietly admitted they admired his boldness. Others confessed they'd wanted pools for years, but were too afraid to cross the HOA. Mark had done what no one else dared. He stood up to the system. But Margaret wasn't finished. The next morning, he found a letter taped to his door, not mailed, but hand-delivered. It stated that the HOA was imposing a daily fine of $500 for unauthorized construction and violation of community aesthetics. It also demanded immediate restoration of the property to its original state. Mark laughed when he read it. The HOA couldn't enforce such a fine legally, but that didn't mean they wouldn't try. Within days, the situation escalated. Margaret filed a formal complaint in small claims court. The HOA's attorney began sending threatening letters, and suddenly, what started as a simple pool became a full-blown neighborhood war. But Mark wasn't afraid. He had evidence, permits, and public support. What Margaret didn't realize was that she'd just picked a fight she couldn't control. And as the first court notice arrived, the entire neighborhood began to take sides. Some stood with Margaret, defending the integrity of the HOA. Others stood with Mark, believing homeowners had the right to enjoy their property without interference. The quiet, perfect streets of Brookstone Ridge were about to erupt into chaos. Because this wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about control, pride, and the lengths one man would go to prove a point. And by the time it was over, Margaret Sloan would learn that the only thing more powerful than HOA rules was someone willing to defy them. The shimmering blue of Mark's new pool reflected across the neighborhood like a mirror of defiance. Every ripple, every glint of sunlight off the water, seemed to mock the HOA's authority. What had once been a quiet cull, DSAC was now the center of a suburban storm. At first, the reaction was a mix of curiosity and envy. Neighbors peeked over fences, children whispered about the forbidden pool, and even those who disapproved couldn't help but be impressed. But for Margaret Sloan, the HOA president, it was nothing short of blasphemy. She saw the pool not as an improvement, but as an insult, a direct challenge to her leadership and the rules she held sacred. In her mind, if Mark Benson got away with this, it would open the floodgates. Lawns would grow wild, fences would sprout neon paint, and Brookstone Ridge would descend into visual anarchy. She refused to let that happen. The HO office became her war room. Files stacked high on her desk, binders full of regulations, maps of property lines, and highlighted sections of bylaws. She spent late nights drafting complaints, rewriting violation notices, and consulting with attorneys. Her obsession consumed her every waking moment. Meanwhile, Mark went about his days as if nothing had changed. He invited friends and family over for weekend barbecues. The laughter, music, and splashing water echoed through the air, a sound that gnawed at Margaret's nerves. Every splash felt like defiance, every laugh like mockery. The HOA's first strike came in the form of a cease and desist order, citing unauthorized alterations to community landscaping and failure to maintain uniform aesthetics. The letter warned of escalating daily fines and potential legal action. But Mark had anticipated this. He had every permit in hand, each stamped and signed by the county. His construction followed every legal guideline. The OA's reach stopped at appearances, and appearances, as the county noted, were subjective. Still, Margaret refused to accept defeat. She called for an emergency HOA meeting, urging residents to vote for a new amendment that would explicitly ban pools of any kind unless pre-approved by the board. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, full of fear-driven rhetoric about declining property values and inconsistent neighborhood appearance. The meeting that followed was chaos. Neighbors filled the community hall, voices rising in tension. Some sided with Margaret, demanding the HOA restore control. Others sided with Mark, accusing the board of overreach and bullying. It wasn't a debate. It was a war of ideals. Margaret's amendment passed, but barely, a narrow victory that gave her the illusion of control. Yet the damage was done. The neighborhood's unity had cracked. Where once people had smiled and waved, now they glared and whispered. Sides had been drawn. Mark refused to remove his pool. The new amendment couldn't be applied retroactively, and Margaret knew it. But that didn't stop her from finding new angles of attack. Soon, Mark began receiving constant inspections. Notices for noise violations appeared on his door. Anonymous complaints claimed unsafe construction and chemical hazards. His trash collection schedule was suddenly questioned, and his mailbox was flagged for being slightly non-standard. It was harassment in every form but name. Yet, for every attempt the HOA made to wear him down, Mark found new ways to rise above it. He documented everything: dates, times, photos, and signatures. He built a thick binder of evidence showing months of targeted behavior. And when the HOA filed a lawsuit demanding removal of the pool, that binder became his weapon. The case quickly drew attention. Local news stations picked up the story of a homeowner fighting back against a tyrannical HOA. The headline spread fast. Man builds pool despite HOA ban. Now faces $100,000 fine. Cameras arrived on Sycamore Court. Reporters interviewed neighbors. Social media exploded with opinions, most of them mocking the HOA's pettiness. Suddenly, Margaret's crusade had backfired spectacularly. The once private neighborhood became a public spectacle. News vans lined the street, drones captured footage of the infamous illegal pool, and online forums dissected every legal detail of the case. Margaret's carefully curated image as the guardian of order crumbled. She became the face of control gone mad, the HOA president who wanted to destroy a man's dream backyard over aesthetics. But humiliation didn't stop her. It hardened her. She doubled down, insisting that the HOA was within its rights and that Mark's defiance would lead to visual decay and lower property standards. She gave interviews of her own, trying to justify the HOA's position. But the more she spoke, the worse it got. Public opinion turned sharply against her. Memes flooded the internet, her face photoshopped with captions like, "No fun allowed," and "Pool police." Even local talk shows mocked the story. And while the world laughed, Margaret stewed. Meanwhile, Mark's pool became more than just a backyard feature. It became a symbol. People drove by to see it, took pictures, and left supportive notes in his mailbox. Strangers sent him letters thanking him for standing up to HOA abuse. The pressure on the HOA board mounted. Members began resigning, unwilling to be part of the fiasco. Fines went unpaid, meetings dissolved into shouting matches, and residents started questioning whether the HOA even had the right to exist anymore. Still, Margaret refused to surrender. She began filing new complaints, this time directly with the county, alleging environmental violations and improper drainage. Inspectors were sent out again, but every time the results came back clean. The walls were closing in on her. The board was crumbling, her supporters disappearing, and her reputation in ruins. But in her mind, the fight wasn't over until Mark Benson's pool was gone. And so, late one night, long after the cameras had left and the streetlights flickered quietly, Margaret began to plan her most desperate move yet. Because if she couldn't win through rules or lawsuits, she'd find another way. The heat of summer deepened over Brookstone Ridge, and while most residents sought shade, Margaret Sloan's bitterness only grew darker under the sun. She had lost control of her pristine neighborhood, her HOA board was collapsing, and her name had become a national punchline. Everywhere she went, she felt the sting of humiliation. The grocery store clerk who smiled too long. The neighbor who crossed the street to avoid her. Even the mailman's casual wave seemed like mockery. She blamed one man for it all, Mark Benson, the homeowner who had defied her authority and turned her quiet kingdom into a circus. Mark, on the other hand, had begun to find peace again. The legal battles had drained him, but the victory, both in court and in the court of public opinion, had given him new confidence. The pool sparkled under the afternoon light, a silent testament to standing up for one's rights. Friends visited again, neighbors chatted by the fence, and the sound of laughter had returned to Sycamore Court. But peace in a neighborhood ruled by an obsessive HOA president never lasted long. Margaret's retaliation began subtly. A local construction company suddenly appeared near Mark's property, tearing up the road for emergency maintenance. Bright orange cones blocked his driveway for days. When he called the city, they had no record of any work order. The company vanished overnight. Then came the noise complaints again. Dozens of them, filed under different names, all targeting Mark's address. Each one forced an inspection, wasting his time and patience. The HOA fines returned too, this time labeled under community disturbance and disrespectful decorum. Every morning brought another envelope, another letterhead, another threat, but Mark didn't react the way she hoped. Instead of breaking, he documented everything, every notice, every incident, every mysterious inconvenience. His binder grew thicker. He had learned that the only way to fight manipulation was with evidence, not anger. The breaking point came when Margaret took her vendetta beyond bureaucracy. Late one night, the sound of splashing woke Mark. The next morning, he found footprints by the pool, muddy, deliberate, leading straight to the fence. A handful of chemical tablets floated in the water, dissolving slowly. They were not his. Tests later revealed the water had been tampered with, but not enough to harm anyone. Just enough to show intent. That was when Mark realized Margaret's obsession had crossed into sabotage. The county investigators opened a new case, citing harassment and potential criminal mischief. Margaret was called in for questioning, and while she denied everything, her composure cracked. The story reignited in the media. HOA president accused of tampering with pool she tried to ban. Brookstone Ridge descended into chaos again. The HOA board fractured completely. 2 members resigned publicly, posting open letters online condemning Margaret's leadership and revealing internal emails that showed her relentless targeting of Mark. The letters went viral within hours. The entire country now knew the extent of her control. Mark became a symbol of freedom, while Margaret became the embodiment of everything people hated about HOAs. But despite the exposure, the battle didn't end. Margaret was clever, too clever to leave a trail that could fully convict her. She maintained her innocence, calling herself the victim of a smear campaign. She claimed Mark had manipulated the situation to make her look bad, and to her remaining allies her words were gospel. Still, the power dynamic had shifted completely. Mark began to rebuild what the conflict had torn apart. He invested in landscaping, installed solar lighting around his property, and even began hosting community events, movie nights, cookouts, and fundraisers. He wanted to restore what the HOA had destroyed, a sense of neighborly connection. Ironically, his pool, once the source of conflict, became the heart of community life. Families gathered there, children played, and laughter filled the air. What had begun as an act of rebellion had become a source of unity. For the first time, the residents of Brookstone Ridge began to question why they needed such strict oversight at all. Petitions circulated quietly to dissolve the HOA entirely. Margaret saw it happening, and it drove her mad. She had built this community from the ground up, spent years enforcing every blade of grass and every shade of paint. To see it unravel, to see her power slip away, was unbearable. One night, unable to sleep, she drove past Mark's house. The pool glowed with soft blue light, the water calm, the sound of crickets filling the air. She parked across the street and stared at it, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. In her mind, it was a symbol of her failure. Every light, every ripple in that water mocked her. The thought formed slowly, dangerous, desperate. If the pool was gone, maybe the story would end. Maybe the world would stop laughing. Maybe her neighborhood would finally return to order. That night, under the veil of darkness, she made her move. She crept through the back alley, carrying a jug of pool acid and gloves. Her heart raced as she reached the fence, her mind spinning with justification. But fate has a cruel way of catching up. A neighbor's security camera, recently installed after the spate of harassment, caught every second. The approach, the shadows, the attempt. The police were called before she even left the property. When the flashing red and blue lights illuminated Sycamore Court, the neighborhood woke to chaos. Margaret was arrested on the spot, her cries echoing through the still night. News vans returned by dawn. The story broke again, louder, harsher, final. HOA president arrested after attempting to destroy pool in ongoing feud. The footage spread like wildfire, solidifying her reputation as the worst HOA president in America. The board was dissolved within days, her position stripped, and legal charges followed soon after. For Mark, it was over. But the taste of victory was bittersweet. The war had ended, but it had left scars on everyone. Neighbors were wary, friendship strained, trust fractured. Still, he knew one thing: peace was finally possible. The next morning, he sat by his pool, the water calm and silent. The neighborhood was quiet again, not with fear, but with relief. The HOA signs were gone, replaced by laughter, freedom, and light. But beneath that calm surface, change was brewing. Because Mark had plans that would ensure no one like Margaret Sloan would ever control Brookstone Ridge again. And those plans would make the next chapter of this story more shocking than anyone expected. The morning after Margaret Sloan's arrest, Brookstone Ridge felt like a different place. The once perfect lawns, the polished mailboxes, and the uniform hedges all stood in quiet disbelief. For years, the community had lived under the illusion of order, an order maintained by fear, fines, and threats. Now, the queen of that order was gone, and what remained was confusion. Some residents were relieved. Others were unsure what came next. The HO office, once bustling with enforcement and paperwork, sat empty, its blinds drawn and its bulletin board bare. The echo of Margaret's rule lingered like a bad dream. Her warning letters still taped to doors, her violation notices still curling under the morning dew. Mark Benson woke up to an inbox full of messages. Journalists requesting interviews, neighbors offering apologies, and strangers thanking him for standing his ground. But fame was never what he wanted. All he had ever wanted was the right to enjoy his home in peace. As the dust settled, the county announced that the Brookstone Ridge HOA was officially suspended pending investigation. With its accounts frozen and leadership under scrutiny, the association ceased to function. For the first time in decades, the residents of the community were free, but freedom came with uncertainty. Without an HOA, there were no rules, no structure, no one to maintain the shared spaces. The once manicured lawns began to grow wild, fences leaned at odd angles, and the entrance sign faded in the sun. What had once looked like perfection now began to feel abandoned. Mark saw it happening and felt a pang of guilt. He had fought for freedom, but had he destroyed something valuable in the process? It was during one of those quiet evenings, as he watched the sunset reflect off the calm surface of his pool, that an idea began to form. Maybe Brookstone Ridge didn't need to return to the way it was. Maybe it could be something better. Over the next weeks, he began reaching out to neighbors, not through fines or official letters, but through genuine conversation. He knocked on doors, invited people to talk, and proposed a new vision. Instead of an HOA ruled by control, they could create a community council based on cooperation. No more punishment for small things. No more petty rules about paint shades or holiday decorations. Just neighbors helping neighbors. At first, people were skeptical. They had grown used to the structure, the comfort of someone else deciding the rules. But Mark's sincerity and his history of standing up for fairness slowly won them over. He hosted the first community renewal meeting by his pool, the same pool that had started it all. Folding chairs circled the water's edge, the air filled with the smell of barbecue and the hum of conversation. There were no official ballots, no power struggles. Just people talking about what kind of neighborhood they wanted to live in. By the end of the night, they had agreed on something revolutionary. Brookstone Ridge would become a self-governed community. No board, no president, just shared responsibility and mutual respect. The transformation was slow but steady. Residents volunteered to repaint the neighborhood sign. Others organized clean-up weekends, planting new flowers at the entrances. Kids helped pick up litter while parents replaced broken lights along the sidewalks. And as the community rebuilt itself, something unexpected happened. People started to smile again. The tension that had poisoned the neighborhood for years began to lift. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now shared laughter across driveways. The invisible fences Margaret had built with her authority began to crumble. Yet, not everyone was pleased with the change. Margaret's old allies, the few who still clung to the belief that strict control was necessary, started whispering about bringing back the HOA once the investigation ended. They warned that without enforcement, property values would plummet, outsiders would move in, and chaos would return. Mark ignored the noise. He knew what real chaos looked like. It was the kind that came with rules written in fear. Meanwhile, the news cycle began to fade. The national attention drifted to other stories, leaving Brookstone Ridge to heal quietly. Margaret herself had vanished from public view. She faced multiple charges, including trespassing and vandalism, but the case was slow moving. Rumors swirled that she had left town entirely, unable to face the humiliation. Life began to feel normal again. But deep down, Mark couldn't shake a feeling that this peace was temporary. He'd seen how obsession could fester, how it could drive a person beyond reason, and Margaret Sloan had never been the kind to admit defeat. One evening, as he closed the gate to his backyard, he noticed something, a shadow near the end of his property. Where the streetlight flickered, it disappeared as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only the sound of footsteps on gravel. He brushed it off at first, assuming it was a late-night jogger. But over the next few days, small things began to happen. A garden hose left running. Trash cans tipped over. Footprints near the fence again. Old instincts stirred. The paranoia, the tension, the feeling of being watched. When he checked his security footage later that week, his stomach tightened. The image was blurry, distorted by motion, but the outline was unmistakable. A woman, middle-aged, wearing a hooded jacket. Margaret Sloan had returned. For Mark, it was a nightmare reborn. For Margaret, it was unfinished business. She had lost her power, her reputation, and her home. But in her mind, she still believed she was right, that Mark had destroyed everything she built. And this time, she wasn't coming back with paperwork or lawyers. She was coming back with revenge. The first chill of autumn rolled into Brookstone Ridge, and with it came unease. The air was sharper, the nights darker, and for Mark Benson, the peace he'd worked so hard to restore began to feel fragile again. At first, it was small things, harmless on their own, but unsettling in pattern. The sound of footsteps in the alley behind his house. The faint scent of cigarette smoke drifting through his backyard at odd hours. A single letter, left on his doorstep with no postage or name. He didn't open it at first. Something about it felt wrong. The crooked handwriting, the faint smudge of dirt across the paper. But curiosity got the better of him. Inside was a single sentence, scrawled in uneven ink. You ruined everything. No signature. No address. But Mark didn't need one. Margaret Sloan had returned to Brookstone Ridge. After months of silence, the former HOA president had re-emerged like a ghost haunting her old empire. The county investigation had closed without jail time. Probation, fines, and a restraining order kept her away from Mark's property. But boundaries meant little to someone whose pride had been broken so completely. She no longer had her position, her power, or her allies. Her home had been foreclosed to pay for legal fees. And somewhere in the cracks of that downfall, she had become something different. Obsessed, vengeful, and unpredictable. No one had seen her directly, but people talked. A shadowy figure near the old HOA office. A woman muttering by the community sign at night. A pair of headlights parked too long at the edge of the cul-de-sac. Mark told himself not to overreact. He had cameras, lights, neighbors, and the law on his side. But paranoia has a way of creeping in when you've already been burned once. Every creak, every rustle, every flicker of movement made him look twice. Then came the vandalism. One morning, he found the words, "A la poêle," spray painted on his fence. A week later, someone slashed the inflatable pool, toys his nieces had left behind. The following night, the power to his security cameras went out, all at once. When the footage came back online, one image froze his blood. A single frame showed a figure, blurry but unmistakably female, staring directly into the lens. The next day, he went to the police, but there was little they could do without clear evidence of trespassing. The restraining order stood, but it was only as strong as her willingness to obey it. The community, once united in rebuilding, began to feel the tension again. People whispered about seeing Margaret's car on the outskirts of the neighborhood. Some claimed she was living in a small trailer outside the city, coming back at night to watch what used to be hers. Mark didn't want fear to take root again. He called a community meeting, assuring everyone that things were under control, that they were stronger than one bitter woman's vendetta. But as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was out there, listening. Days turned into weeks. The air grew colder, and the pool, once a symbol of triumph, now lay covered under a tarp, still and silent. Then came the fire. It started one night after midnight, when a flicker of orange glowed at the edge of Mark's backyard. The dry leaves ignited quickly, flames racing up the fence line. By the time the fire department arrived, the fence was gone, a corner of his shed reduced to ash. The fire chief ruled it as likely arson, but there was no proof. Still, Mark knew. Deep down he knew. The next morning, as he walked the perimeter of the damage, he found it. A single matchbox, soaked but unburned, lying near the remains of the fence. On the side was the logo of the Elm Street Motel, a small roadside inn 15 miles away. He drove there that afternoon. The motel was run down, its sign flickering in the gray daylight. The clerk barely looked up as Mark approached, but when he showed Margaret's photo, the man nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "She's been here a few weeks." Room 12. Mark didn't go to the door. He called the police from the parking lot. They arrived within minutes. What followed was a scene that spread through town like wildfire. Margaret Sloan, disheveled and furious, dragged from her motel room while shouting about her community, or rules, and her reputation. Inside the room, officers found files, photos, and notes. Hundreds of pages documenting Mark's property, his schedule, even his visitors. She had been planning something far worse than vandalism. The story broke across the county news. Former HOA president arrested again after harassment, arson attempt. The coverage reignited the national spotlight. The same reporters who had once interviewed her about aesthetic integrity now painted her as a cautionary tale of obsession. For the residents of Brookstone Ridge, it was both shocking and relieving. The ghost had finally been caught. Mark tried to move forward. The restraining order became permanent, and Margaret was ordered to undergo psychological evaluation. The police assured him that she would not be returning anytime soon. But even as he stood in his backyard, looking at the charred remains of his fence and the rebuilt edges of his pool, he couldn't shake the thought that this chapter wasn't entirely closed. People like Margaret didn't just disappear. They lingered in memory, in fear, in the echoes of what they destroyed. That night, he sat by the water again, watching the surface ripple softly in the cool wind. The reflection of the stars danced across it. Peaceful, almost cleansing. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood was silent. And yet, from that silence, a realization grew. The fight with Margaret Sloan had changed more than just Brookstone Ridge. It had changed Mark himself. He was no longer just a homeowner defending his right to enjoy his property. He had become something else. A symbol, a reminder that freedom often came at a cost. But that cost had bought something priceless, a neighborhood that had finally learned to stand together. As winter approached, he decided to make one final change, something that would permanently erase the shadow of what had happened. He began drafting plans, working late into the night, sketching and revising, driven by a single goal. The next summer, Brookstone Ridge would see something extraordinary, a project that would turn the source of its darkest feud into its greatest treasure. It wouldn't just be a pool anymore. It would be a legacy. Winter faded slowly from Brookstone Ridge, leaving behind crisp mornings and soft rays of spring sunlight. The cold had dulled the noise of the past months, the chaos, the fear, and the anger. But now, as the days grew longer, something new began to stir within the community. For the first time in years, peace felt real. The lawns were still uneven, the fences mismatched, and the once immaculate hedges had grown wild. Yet somehow, the neighborhood looked alive again. It was no longer a stage for control, but a home for people who had learned the hard way what freedom meant. Mark Benson had spent the long winter rebuilding, not just his property, but his sense of purpose. The scars of the fire still marked one corner of his yard, a dark reminder of the conflict that had nearly destroyed everything. But where others saw damage, he saw opportunity. The idea had taken root in the quiet, an idea not born of revenge, but of renewal. He wanted to transform the pool that started it all into something that would outlive every feud, every fine, and every rulebook. A space that would stand as proof that unity could rise from division. And so, the plans began. Mark submitted designs to the county for what he called the Brookstone Community Oasis, a public space that would include his expanded pool, a shared recreation area, garden terraces, and an open pavilion for community gatherings. He would fund the first phase himself and open it to every resident of the neighborhood. No memberships. No rules about paint shades, fence heights, or mailbox colors. Just a place to come together. At first, people doubted it would work. After all, Brookstone Ridge had lived for years under the shadow of division. But the same neighbors who once argued over lawns now volunteered to help. Some offered tools, others materials. Kids painted signs. Retired residents helped landscape. The sound of construction replaced the echoes of conflict. Hammer strikes, laughter, music drifting from portable speakers. The transformation became a neighborhood effort, a way to rebuild more than fences and driveways, to rebuild trust. When summer finally arrived, the project was complete. The once forbidden pool, now stretched across the heart of the cul-de-sac, surrounded by flower beds, picnic tables, and solar lanterns that flickered softly at night. The pavilion stood nearby, painted in warm tones, with a plaque mounted at its entrance. It read, "Freedom built this," dedicated to every neighbor who stood up for fairness and found peace in unity. The opening day was unlike anything Brookstone Ridge had ever seen. Families arrived carrying food, folding chairs and coolers. Children splashed in the pool while parents gathered under the shade, sharing stories and laughter. For the first time, the water that had once divided them now reflected something beautiful, the faces of a community reborn. Mark stood back, watching it all unfold. The sunlight danced across the water, just as it had the day he finished building it years ago. But now the ripples carried no defiance, no resentment, only peace. Neighbors who once refused to speak now worked side by side, grilling food and passing out drinks. Even those who had once supported Margaret Sloan came, their faces marked by quiet remorse. There was no tension left, only understanding. And then, as if time itself wanted to close the story properly, a letter arrived in Mark's mailbox that evening. It was postmarked from a correctional facility 100 miles away. The handwriting was familiar, shaky, deliberate. It was from Margaret. The letter was short, A single page, carefully written. She didn't apologize directly, but her words carried the weight of someone who had finally faced herself. She wrote of reflection, of regret, of realizing too late what her obsession had cost. She mentioned the news, that she had seen what Brookstone Ridge had become. Her final line read simply, "It's better this way. Take care of my neighborhood." Mark folded the letter quietly and set it aside. There was no anger left in him, only closure. Weeks passed, and the oasis became the heart of Brookstone Ridge. Local papers wrote stories about it, how a neighborhood once divided by HOA tyranny had rebuilt itself through kindness. The headlines called it the town that freed itself. Even years later, people still remembered. Children who had once watched their parents argue over property lines now grew up playing in the pool that changed everything. The story of the HOA feud became local legend, retold at barbecues, neighborhood events, and even online. They told it not as a story of revenge, but as a story of resilience. And every summer evening, as the lanterns glowed and the water shimmered, Mark would sit by the edge of the pool, listening to the soft hum of laughter and conversation. Sometimes he thought about how it all began, a simple argument over a pool, a rule too strict, a president too proud, and a man too stubborn to back down. Yet from that stubbornness came something pure, proof that community isn't built on control, but on understanding. Years later, when the county officially recognized the Brookstone Community Oasis as a historical landmark, Mark's name was etched onto a small brass plaque beside the gate. It didn't list his victories, his lawsuits, or his interviews. It simply read, "For standing up when no one else would." And that was enough. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting gold across the calm surface of the water. The air was quiet again, the kind of quiet that didn't come from fear, but from peace earned through struggle. The HOA was gone. The fear was gone. But the story remained, whispered in laughter, carried by memory, reflected in the water that once started a war and ended up healing an entire neighborhood. As the lights shimmered across the pool and the evening breeze stirred the trees, Mark smiled to himself. The HOA had tried to ban his pool. But in the end, that pool had built something far greater, a legacy no one could ever take away.